gonna be honest with you. I just got back from a retreat and I have not been sleeping great lately. And boy, pretty tired, but gonna give this a shot, right? Live your life to the fullest, right? So, if you know anything about religion and you're a Christian, or you're reading the Bible, or if you know anything about Jesus and his parables, or you're a Muslim or whatever, right? Whatever you believe about Jesus, don't really care. But basically, if you know anything about Jesus, you probably know something about the fact that he was a teacher and he taught in parables mostly, telling basically just a story that he just kind of made up, and there was a deep lesson in it. And often there would be multiple lessons, multiple interpretations in just one parable. And recently on this retreat, I heard the parable of the sower. Now I've heard this parable 100 times, right? And it's a good parable, right? I never really thought too much about it. And basically, the parable of the sower is there's a guy working on a farm, and his job was to plant the seeds. And so he would have like buckets of seeds, and he'd walk over to the field, and some of those seeds would fall out of that bucket and they fall on the path that he was walking on. And because it's the desert and it's a dirt path that and from people and animals and carts and all that stuff walking on it, just gets packed down really hard. And because he dropped those seeds on that path, they couldn't take root, right? They weren't going to grow because it was so packed hard that they couldn't sink their roots in deep. And so birds came and they ate those seeds. And he kept walking, and before he got to the field, he dropped some on this like really rocky, like gravelly soil, just kind of by accident. He was just kind of throwing seeds everywhere. Honestly, he doesn't sound like a very great planter, but he was just throwing seeds everywhere. Some of those seeds, they fell on these rocks, and it was the same story as the path. They couldn't sink their roots in deep enough to grow, and so they sprouted, and then the sun cooked them away. They couldn't hold any moisture because they were just growing on rock. And then the next handful fell on oh, sorry. The next handful fell in basically just a bunch of thorns, a bunch of brambles. And they sprouted and they tried to grow, but they got choked out by these thorns. And then finally, because this guy was a bad planter and he was just throwing them absolutely just everywhere, just going crazy with it, I guess. I don't know what he was doing. But some of those seeds actually fell where they're supposed to fall, which is on good, fertile soil that holds its moisture, and those seeds took root and produced crops. Now, a lot of people look at this story and say, okay, so God is the sower, right? And honestly, that's what most people think, for a good reason. That's a pretty natural interpretation. Usually when Jesus was telling these parables, if he didn't name the person, they were probably supposed to be a metaphor for God. But the other thing to take into account, right, is if the sower is God, then most people interpret this parable as God puts us in puts humans everywhere, right? He just throws us everywhere, right? And the natural interpretation is we are the seeds, and where we fall will determine our fate, right? And people say that's a good parable, right? And honestly, I never liked this parable. I always thought it was kind of vague and honestly kind of depressing. And people would say this and like be happy about it, and I was always confused by that. And I started thinking about it more and more of why I wasn't happy with the answer people were giving me with this parable. And it's because, to me, right, being on self-improvement, I believe very deeply that people can change, people can grow, people can evolve, people can overcome whatever circumstances they're placed in. And so a lot of people will look at this parable and say, yes, we are kind of thrown everywhere, but we can move, right? We can, even though seeds don't move, we're supposed to assume that we can move. Like if we're thrown to the thorns, like if we're thrown to a bad lifestyle, thrown to a bad home, bad family, whatever circumstance it is, you can still overcome that and go to the rocky soil. God's calling us to be in the rocky soil. And not the rocky soil, shoot, sorry. I'm really tired, man. There's a lot going on right now. I got animals running around. Someone's talking way over there. I don't know what's going on. Oh, man. Oh. Don't stay up super late for several nights in a row. And then get up super early for several nights in a row. What is it? Yeah. God's calling us to be in the fertile soil. Now, how I've started to think about this parable, however, though, because it doesn't always make sense, right? If you think the natural thinking of God being the planter doesn't always really make sense. And so I started to rethink about this, and I realized, what if God isn't the planter? What if you're the planter? What if what Jesus is trying to tell us in this parable is not that, yes, God is kind of a bad planter and just throws his seeds everywhere, and you fell into the thorns, oh well, looks like you're not going to grow, right? That's not God. God is the guy, like the guy who owns the farm and gave the planter the seeds. And we're the planter. And those seeds aren't necessarily us. They're our souls. They are our lives, our fate. And it's up to us to decide where we put ourselves, where we put our energy, where we put where we choose to live, how we choose to live, the lifestyle we choose for ourselves. And because we are bad planters, we just throw the seeds everywhere. We drop them as we're walking along. We're not really looking. We're just tossing them wherever, hoping they grow. And we probably get fired. But God trusts us to choose our best fate, to plant our crops in the best spot. The problem is, like I said before, we suck at planting. Now, for me, I love gardening, and I actually grow pumpkins and I sell pumpkins just kind of for fun. And whenever we're working on our pumpkin field, often what happens is you got these bags of seeds and you're dumping them in your hand, you're dumping them in these things, and a lot of times you spill them. They go everywhere, and then these little pumpkin seeds, and they bounce off the clay soil and they go everywhere, and you have to, a lot of times you have to, once you spill them, you go, oh shoot, you don't just leave them there because you're not a bad planter. You have to bend down and slowly pick them up in the hot sun and go plant them, and sometimes you mess up, sometimes you gotta rebury them. So if you want to be a good planter for yourself, when you spill your seeds, when you throw them in a place that you don't necessarily want them to be, right? You throw them in the thorns, you throw them on the rocky soil or the path, whatever it is, it's up to you to pick those seeds up and take them where they need to go. Put them in the fertile soil. Put them where they need to be, right? No matter where your story began, if your story began in a bad place, in a bad home, whatever it is, you can overcome that. You can grow and change and evolve and become the best version of yourself. You can accomplish your goals and live the life that you want to live. You can do that, but it might be difficult. Dropping your seeds in the thorns, like that's going to be really annoying to pull those out. And honestly, if I did that, I wouldn't bother. I'd just leave them there. But if you truly want to live your best life, you might have to pull them out of the thorns. You might have to get your hands and your arms all cut up because you're trying to rescue seeds. Trying to rescue yourself. You might go through trials and difficulties that most people can't imagine. But in the end, it's worth it because you get to plant those seeds in fertile soil where they're going to grow and they're going to give you the best possible life you could possibly hope for. So live your best life. you're not bound by fate. You're not bound by where you start, because you can always pick up your seeds. You can always put them where they need to be, right? You can always start again, right? Even if, your seeds have already grown, maybe they've already started to produce their fruit, right? Maybe started to produce their crops. You can always replant. And say you have a bad year, you have a bad yield, right? This happens with farmers all around us, right? This year wasn't really a great year for some crops, right? Especially wheat. But that's okay, because the next year you can replant. The next year you can choose to change. You can choose to build a better life. So live the best life you can. That's all I got for today. God bless you, and stay wild.